And this is for you doctors, okay? Since we have two doctors today, I found a medical story for you guys. A genome study unveils genetic ties between cannabis use disorder and lung cancer risk. Now, just by the title, I feel that this is already written by some prohibitionists, but I want to see what the doctors have to say. In a recent study published by Nature Genetics, researchers conducted a genome-wide association study, GWAS, to gain novel insights into the pathophysiology of cannabis use disorder and pathophysiology. Thank you, Dr. Mark. Pathophysiology of cannabis use disorder and public health concerns associated with the disorder. Cannabis is a psychoactive drug with a long history of illegal use. That paragraph doesn't matter. Recently, many countries throughout the world have approved the use of cannabis for medical purposes and decriminalized its adult use. In the United States, medical use of cannabis has been authorized in 37 states, whereas adult use cannabis is available in 19 states. With the recent changes in cannabis law, a gradual increase in the prevalence of cannabis use disorder has been observed worldwide, they say. A GWAS meta-analysis of cannabis use disorder was conducted using the Million Veteran Program database, which is one of the largest biobanks in the world that compiles with genetic, health, and lifestyle data to facilitate genetic research. Additionally, a meta-analysis was conducted on data obtained from 1,054,365 individuals of European, African, and mixed American and East Asian ancestries designated by the reference panel used for the assignment. Single nucleoid polymorphism, SNP, based habitually was calculated within each ancestry using population-specific methods. A total of 22 independent genome-wide significant GWS loci were identified within European ancestry, 2 GWS loci within African ancestry, and GWS locus within admixed American ancestry, and 2 GWS loci within East Asian ancestry. That's a lot of Lokis. The lead SMP for European ancestry was near the cholinergic receptor nicotinic alpha-2 submit encoding gene. For African ancestry, the lead SMP was in intron of gene that encodes for a pH-dependent proton-coupled amino acid transporter for glycine, aniline, and proline. For admixed American ancestry, the lead SNP was in an intergetic region downstream of the leucine-rich repeat containing 3B. For East Asian ancestry, the lead SMP was intronic to the symphorium 6D encoding gene. Comparative analysis of cannabis use disorder and cannabis use trials with a range of psychiatric and non-psychiatric traits showed a much more substantial overlap of cannabis use disorder with pathological and negative traits. The calculation of SMP-based herbality within each ancestral group identified significant SMP-based herbality for 3 larger ancestries, including European, African, and mixed American ancestries. The comparison of genetic correlations between cannabis use disorder and cannabis use revealed that the strongest positive correlations are related to smoking inhalation and alcohol dependence. Comparatively, the strongest negative correlations are related to the age of first intercourse and smoking cessation. Further analysis identified a bioretical causal relationship between cannabis use disorder and schizophrenia. Regarding the differences between the cannabis use and cannabis use disorder, the analysis showed that cannabis use disorder is much more closely associated with psychopathology. A unidirectional causal effect of multi-site chronic pain on cannabis use disorder was observed in the study, and this indicates that chronic pain might act as a driving factor for cannabis use disorder. The analysis further identified a unidirectional causal effect of cannabis use disorder on lung cancer Conditional analysis of this result was smoking inhalation did not significantly alter the relationship between cannabis use disorder and lung cancer. However, the conditional analysis with cigarettes each day mitigated this relationship. A transcriptome-wide association study identified 36 and 15 genes using the adult and fetal brain fetal cortex expression, respectively DALR, anecdotron binding domain containing 3 DALRD3 was the only common gene in these gene tests. Nonsense mutations in the gene are known to be associated with developmental delay and early onset epileptic encephalopathy. And the observed gene associations included 4 district GWAS loci, including DALRD3, both fetal and adult, and ERCC8 fetal, and RP11-629G13.1 in adults, and PLPPP2 for adults. Proteins encoded by these genes are associated with various cancer types, including breast cancer, esophageal cancer, and multiple melanoma. The estationin of SMP-based herbality of cannabis use disorder showed significant enrichments for the fetal brain frontal cortex, but not for the adult brain cortex. This enriched fetal SMP-based herbality indicates that the development brain that in the developing brain, genetic factors might play a role in inducing cannabis use disorder, even in the absence of cannabis exposure. The study finds a significant difference between cannabis use and cannabis use disorder, and genetic liabilities to cannabis use disorder exhibit a much stronger association of psychopathology and disability. Notably, the study finds a causal link between cannabis use disorder and lung cancer risk. Well, I just read a whole bunch of stuff that I would love some in-depth intellectual knowledge on from our two esteemed doctors that we have on here on the panel. And thank you so much, doctors, for your help with some of those words.
I don't know what I just read.
Hit the applause button for making it through that that article, Jason. You did a great job.
Amazing. That's what I'm talking about.
Where's the applause button? There should be an applause
I don't know,
button.
Adam, they're asking for the applause button, Adam. There we go. Adam is on it. Yes.
So,
there we go.
Dr. Gene, you want me to take this?
Go for it.
Okay. Yeah. So this is super interesting and really cool on what they're doing in terms of trying to read correlations between cannabis use disorder. I always think of, okay, what is that exactly? Well, that's just stoners. Okay. So stoners. So whenever you hear cannabis use disorders, or disorder, just insert, the word stoners in there. It's okay. What are they looking at? And so this SNP, or these things called single nucleotide polymorphism, which is just a fancy word for a marker in a piece of DNA. And what they do when they do these, what was the other acronym you used? GWAS is a genome-wide association study, where what they look for are correlations between, again, I guess, a population of stoners, people who suffer from cannabis use disorder. And what they see is they start to see correlations. And I really like that this crosswise correlation to cancer susceptibility is really, really cool, because now you're kind of looking at like how cannabis acts on the human genome to kind of reprogram it, or maybe again just to send off little alarm signals to physicians like Dr. Talleyrand around patient susceptibility towards certain diseases, cancer in particular, which would be really cool, because then you would look at maybe other symptoms and say, hey, we shouldn't ignore that. Let's have a CAT scan done, or let's, look at this patient a little bit more in depth. But I think this is just the beginning of what they can do with, everyone's talked about like genomic analysis, and it's not so much reading the information, because we do have now the sophisticated tools and things like CRISPR and all these other acronyms that win people Nobel Prizes and things like that. But these things have great utility in the arena of medicine to look at real unknown between kind of like cannabis and cannabis use is how our own bodies, which are expressing the receptors that cannabis and the cannabinoids bind with, is just really such an important piece of the puzzle. And I think studies like this will help scientists and doctors and medical professionals really understand not just cannabis use disorder. I think that's just kind of like a bullshit term for, again, stoners, people who use a lot of cannabis, but to understand what that does at the genetic level and how that influences different susceptibilities to diseases. But I'd be great to hear from Dr. Talleyrand if he agrees like with what I'm saying here.
Well, you bring up a good point. I mean, the reason for genetic testing is really to predict, right? I mean, in the practical real world, we want to be able to predict if you're going to have a negative outcome from something. But using genetics alone is problematic because there are what we call epigenetic factors, factors outside your DNA. And for those who have trouble understanding, think about a blueprint for building a house or remodeling a house. Often you have a blueprint, but when you actually go and do the remodeling, it doesn't actually completely follow the blueprint. There's real world and there's the DNA, right? And looking at the real world is important. So when you think about cannabis use disorder and their ability to say that 10 to 30% of the population has cannabis use disorder, but when you actually look at the real world, you don't see that. You don't see people having problems with cannabis. Then you just have a poor definition already, and then trying to link it with genes just makes it poor on top of poor. I'm not a big fan of this study. This came out of Yale, and I have concerns, that Yale is being funded by the pharma industry and is looking to pull out negative information on cannabis.
I'm with that.
But yeah.
So Dr. T labels this as a prohibitionist piece.
Well, and the editor didn't. Sorry, I was just going to add the editor didn't help, and I'm blaming the editor because it's usually the editor that chooses the headline. That at the very end it says, "Oh, and there was not causal, but a casual link," and that becomes the headline of it's lung cancer. I'm just can we just even aim for any semblance of accuracy in the headline that never gets pulled back? It's the headline that is the jolt to the system that everybody points to, not the retraction, not showing that the metadata studies actually excluded anything that showed anything positive as far as results, and also only studied people with problems instead of all the other people that had no problems that raised their hand because they didn't to be a part of this study. It's just frustrating as all get out.
Well, that and the well-established 40-year study of Dr. Donald Tashkin at UCLA, which basically proved exactly the opposite of what the government intended it for it to prove, which is that, like cigarette smoking cannabis was going to lead to lung cancer. And what he found was that people who smoked cannabis had lower incidence of lung disease from people who don't smoke anything at all.
It's protective.
Right?
Same with alcohol. Yeah.
Right. Describes the prophylactic properties that these compounds have when inhaled into the lungs. Now, that doesn't mean, and Dr. Talleyrand, correct me if I'm wrong, doesn't mean that smoking weed can cure cancer. It does not mean that. But it does mean in a statistically significant, and this wasn't in mice neither, this was in humans, which is great, funded by our tax dollar, right? By NIDA, because they wanted to prove it to be bad, right? And they found that it wasn't bad at all. So, I mean, yeah.
And even in this study, I thought I read a sentence in the, not the study, but your story that even said that something about, tobacco use might might have played a part. And that's the other issue with
Yeah,
a lot
but-
of these studies is they don't account for tobacco use at all. And then they point to the cannabis as part of the problem when it was the tobacco that they were also smoking, or the blunt, which I try to explain in class is once you wrap it in tobacco, you're smoking tobacco.
Yeah, I mean, Dr. T, I totally hear what you're saying about it being done at Yale and certainly Connecticut, big cradle of the pharmaceutical industry. But here's my thinking. People are using cannabis, and this population that they studied, this cannabis use disorder, those are stoners. They're linking this now genetically to enzymes. I mean, think about it. This is kind of like the outside in insult of these compounds into the human body. And what these folks are reading genetically is how is the body genetic at a genetic level reacting to it. As a scientist, I'm like, cool. We need to know that because, is it efficacious against certain aspects of cancer because you're getting cannabinoids into the fatty tissues of your body where free radicals can do damage? I mean, absolutely. And that's why we say the underpinnings of all cannabis use is medical because of this antioxidant, anti-inflammatory activity that you get no matter how you use cannabis. But at the end of the day, and I agree with what you're saying, is that, if they're trying to draw some, connection between cannabis use and cancer, I mean, that train's left the station years ago, and that ain't happening.
They want
Exactly,
me to make that,
revisionist. Go
they
ahead,
want us
Rico.
to make that connection. They can't, sir.
And yet they still do.
They still try.
Nick in the chat, he's saying that he brought up the U.S. Health Department patent on cannabis as a neuroprotectant, and they told me I was wrong.
No, they actually have 2 patents on
It's
that.
expired now. It expired
They
this year.
renew? Oh, I thought they renewed. They didn't renew this year.
I don't know if the new one's expired. I know that the classic one from 2003, the neuroprotectants that they filed. The ironic thing about that is that they smuggled the cannabinoids into Bethesda from Meshulam's lab back in the 60s to do that initial work. So they broke their own laws to basically get that work done. So.
Doctor,
but it also shows, and Dale, you bring up a great point because the U.S. Patent Office doesn't give a shit about drug policy or drug law. When they find an invention, they found that these things had this neuroprotective properties. And part of the neuroprotective properties is, again, these cannabinoids act as antioxidants to quench reactive oxygenated species, which lead to free radical mediated damage that often underpins cancer growth. So it's just beautiful that the government itself has demonstrated medical use when Schedule 1 says there is no demonstrated medical use. So how could the plant from which these compounds are derived still be Schedule 1 claiming no medical use when the USPTO, a different branch of the government, has independently said these things have medical use because they have neuroprotective properties?
And in regards with this, Dr. Talleyrand, Nick in the audience has a quick question for you. He says that his neurologist has told him 5+ times that cannabis causes seizures, and he says that he asked him where he's taken if he's taken further education on cannabis, and he wouldn't answer him, and just doubled down that cannabis causes seizures, and basically said, "I've been doing this for 25 years, and you should listen to me."
His doctor told him that he's been being a doctor for 25 years.
Yeah. That he's been a doctor doing this for 25 years, and he should listen to him, and basically not. And so
what I would say is that the medical, practicing for 25 years, the medical establishment has not acknowledged the endocannabinoid system or done any work on educating on the endocannabinoid system. And so I wouldn't look to his doctor, his neurologist, as an expert in phytocannabinoids or the endocannabinoid system, unless he's looked outside of medicine and looked at the science, then he's not speaking from a place of authority.
All right, and I'm getting
It's
asked.
just because you've been doing something 25 years don't make you good at it.
That's right.
Well, and my point
Right.
was practice. You need to keep practicing and keep learning. And there's, if you go by what he learned 25 years ago in medical school, then he's
Right.
probably not a great doctor if he isn't
World.
staying on top of new
He's-
information. Find another doctor is my recommendation.
He would be considered like a politician that is unwilling to evolve. But on that, I'm getting told we got to go to a commercial. We're going to be right back.